With the launch of the X-Men franchise back in July of 2000, it didn't take long for fans to fall in love with the titular cast of characters. But as it turns out, the first installment could have been a lot longer, at least according to our very own Hugh Jackman. So, let's take a look at what this actually means. The reveal. For those of you who've been living under a rock since the beginning of the new millennium, Hugh Jackman was brought on by Fox to portray one of the most important superheroes in the history of the network. We are, of course, referring to his stint as Wolverine, the Weapon X variant that went on to become a hero of Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters. Introduced in the very first installment of the original X-Men trilogy, with the majority of the film actually being shot from his perspective. There's no doubt that Jackman left a mark on the geeks of the world. In an instance, kids across the globe wanted to have adamantium claws protruding from their knuckles, and Hugh was, to a certain extent, typecast as the Wolverine. Not like he was complaining though, as this opportunity allowed him to put the character to bed in March of 2017 when he gave his life for X-23 in the film Logan. An emotional experience for all of us, but one that we remember fondly. Surprisingly enough though, this hasn't stopped Jackman from getting asked about his former character time and time again, especially now that the Marvel Cinematic Universe is opening up to characters that were previously under the exclusive control of Fox. In fact, when the Australian superstar was talking to Colander a few weeks ago about his latest film, Reminiscence, he ended up revealing that the first installment of the X-Men franchise actually had more cut content than he originally thought. It isn't exactly a revelation to note, considering just how much movies are changed nowadays in post-production. But according to Hugh Jackman, the scenes that were cut amounted to around 47 minutes of content, some being quite important in the lead-up to plot explanation and character development. Some scenes even introduced new characters by name who didn't have much to do with the franchise as a whole, but acted as a great set of Easter eggs for fans of the X-Men comics. Granted, this was a while ago, but we trust that Jackman knows what he's talking about. In his own words, "I'm probably speaking out of school, Steve, but a week before it came out, I think it was 47 minutes longer. I may be exaggerating or under-exaggerating. It was a lot, and maybe the week is an exaggeration, but I remember going, what happened to that scene? And that character? Wait, what? Wait, huh? Whoa." That movie, from my memory, is about 100 minutes, I think. It was a lot longer. So that was definitely a surprise to me. So as it turns out, Fox ended up cutting just under an hour's worth of footage around a week before the eventual release of the first film, which is quite intense. That being said, the decision does make sense when you really think about it. Since this was one of the first Marvel superhero team-up movies in the history of cinema, there was a lot riding on the viewer experience of the installment. The studio had so many plans when it came to the future of the franchise and wanted to ensure that the film was not only digestible for fans of the comics, but audiences who had never heard of the X-Men before then. Remember, there's a process that films go through before they're released, so let's take a look at what could have happened before then. The testing process. Whenever a network or studio has a new idea in the pipeline, they get a group of people together to form what is known as a testing audience. After pitching the idea to the testing audience, the studio will then know whether the majority of people out there will respond to the movie that they want to make. This isn't the last testing audience that's used though. Once the movie's been filmed and put together in post-production, the end product is usually shown to another testing group to see whether the reviewed outcome is in line with the previous statistics they were able to gather. It's then based on these final reviews that the film is changed or kept the same, depending on what precisely is said about it in the anonymous reviews. So what we're thinking is that the original cut of the first X-Men installment was considered to be a bit too long by the generic audience. It's also possible that the obscure references to characters like Jubilee went right over their heads, causing a less than positive reaction to the dropping of her character name. Since this cut footage would have paid a lot more fan service and resulted in a film that had less plot holes than the original, fans have been asking for the original Bryan Singer cut, similarly to how they requested the Snyder cut of the Justice League. That being said, there isn't much hope for a release such as this since this film is already over 20 years old. Fox also no longer owns the characters in question, with them being absorbed in the Disney takeover and currently being under the control of Kevin Feige. And since we have total faith in what Marvel has done over the last couple of years, with special reference being made to its out-of-the-box concepts such as WandaVision and Loki, there's no doubt that the X-Men will be appearing from the multiverse of madness in no time at all. In other words, there's more of a chance that we'll be able to relive the majesty of this first installment in a few years' time, albeit under the control of another studio. The scenes that Hugh Jackman was probably talking about, the news of the first installment of the X-Men franchise having some cut content didn't come completely out of left field though. The Blu-ray version of the film actually came with some additional content that had been otherwise cut from the film, informing viewers that there were some references that had to be taken out due to time constraints. Nothing close to 47 whole minutes of cut content, but definitely something that could be matched up to what Hugh Jackman said in that interview with Collider. So if you wanted to know more about the specific references that our very own Wolverine made, stay tuned, as we're about to take a look at some examples of scenes that were cut. Number 1, the introduction of Jubilee. First of all, the bonus content of the Blu-ray version of X-Men introduced the world to a powerful mutant by the name of Jubilee. For those of you who don't know, Jubilee is a mutant with the ability to shoot firework-like energy from her body, often resulting in a spectacle that is both visually appealing and dangerous to anyone that finds themselves in the way of her release. Although she played a pretty big role in X-Men Apocalypse, she was actually shown for a brief few seconds in the very first installment of the franchise, where she introduces herself to Rogue by name. The scene takes place in a classroom that's being headed by Storm, who appears to be teaching the children about the introduction of Christianity into the Roman Empire back in the day. Surprisingly enough, we actually see a version of this scene in the final product where Bobby goes on to freeze Pyro's fireball, causing it to go crashing to the ground and disrupting the class. The extended scene also shows Bobby and Rogue's first interaction with one another in a lot more detail, as Jubilee looks on toward them in the background. It's certainly a scene that we would have loved to see in the original release, especially since a lot of work was put into the look and feel of Jubilee as a character. But since things were a little long-winded, we understand why it was essentially cut and included as bonus content. Number 2, Logan's longing glance. Another short moment that was excluded from the original release involved Hugh Jackman's character Wolverine watching Cyclopses give a class on the mechanics of motor vehicles. Asking a student to point out where exactly a carburetor can be found, we see Cyclops lovingly stroking Jean Grey's hand, which is our first real introduction to the two characters as a couple. We also notice a look in Logan's eyes that Jackman pulls off excellent. It's the start of a love triangle that went on to define the franchise and perfectly summed up what was to come in the next few minutes. That being said, enough had already been done in the original cut to deem this scene unnecessary. We all know how Logan and Jean came to feel about one another after all, and adding this would have essentially added nothing to the end product at the end of the day. Number 3, Rogue's feelings are discussed. Another character around which the first installment centers is Rogue, who clearly just wants to live a normal life after almost killing her boyfriend with her powers. While we only get to understand what she wants later on in the film, a scene just after the class with Storm actually paints a clearer picture. In this scene, we see Halle Berry's Rogue approach the teenage mutant, asking whether the class was too tough for her or not. The topic of discussion then changes to Logan, with Rogue asking Storm whether he is okay considering the damage that had previously been done to him. As we're all aware of, Rogue has a little crush on Logan, something that becomes pretty clear with this piece of dialogue. And then we hear Rogue asking about Professor X and whether he can actually cure her of her affliction. When Storm comments that the school doesn't really work like that, we can see that Rogue is visibly upset by the answer. It serves as foreshadowing of the moment that Rogue decides to stand in line to take the cure in the third installment, but is unfortunately left out of the original cut of the first X-Men movie. What do you think of the exclusion of this cut content though? Be sure to let us know in the comments section down below.